Hello everyone, I'm Matt, and today we're making a fuss. Or to be exact, a Methuss. After the lovely time I had with the real grade RX-78-2, I figured it'd be a good idea to build a bit of a simpler kit, which naturally translated to building a transforming one from nearly 20 years ago. Whilst this channel is mainly focused on my model kit builds so far, the Transformers franchise accounts for the majority of my small plastic robot collection, and whilst there's some cracking designs and engineering involved, I've always felt Gunpla transformations haven't quite reached that level of intuition, maybe besides the 888 of her car. Much of this is down to differences in material and design however, so the comparison isn't really a fair one. Gunpla kits have to snap together, but Transformers are pre-built with pins and screws and whatnot. Anyhow, we're getting the Gunpla shed properly inaugurated with the weird and wonderful world of Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam, a series with the franchise's first Transformers as well as some of its most out there designs. And that's not even taking advance of Zeta into account. Today's subject is the very yellow Transformer and surprise star of the now shuttered Gundam Evolution video game, the Methuss. The high-grade Methuss was released way back in 2006, so a fair bit of the kit has elements avoided by the Bandai of today, such as some prominent seam lines on large areas and an emphasis on ABS plastic for joint parts. There's a fair few stickers as well, including some green sensor ones, which are nice, and some colour correcting black and red ones, which are less nice, but I did use most of them in the end. The polycaps are also rather unique, with a much brighter shade of grey plastic than usual. Starting with the head, it builds quickly and it looks the part, although the mono eye being static is a little disappointing, if understandable on a kit close to 18 years old. I chose the centered eye sticker, but it wasn't very visible under the head sight thingy, so I switched to the side eye sticker instead. Speaking of the head sight thingy, it's an absurdly small piece, which I learned the hard way when it flew off as I tried to plug it in. Good start to the build. As a replacement, I chopped up some spur runner and glued it up. The plastic glue melted it together, and then I sanded it to shape and size. I painted it full black this time, as seen in the original anime. On that note, the new piece is far thicker than the original, as I found trying to replicate the original piece's dimensions nigh impossible, at least with my resources. Again, the final look isn't entirely similar to the anime appearance, so I can live with it. The pegs that connect the shoulder to the torso are rather unique, with the main joint being connected to a vertically aligned polycap. However, the completed torso only has enough clearance for the backwards and forwards movement of the main joint, although I don't think it would be too hard to mod the vertical movement in. Out of caution regarding stability however, I elected to leave the joints untouched. The main work I did on the torso was painting with Gundam markers. I filled in some grey on the neck area, followed by a generous helping of gold on the vents, something I did throughout most of the kit for some more visual interest and implied part separation. There are some red stickers provided for around the chest of the suit, and whilst I did paint these using a red Gundam marker, it initially proved as inconsistent as ever, going on with a very dark metallic finish, but fortunately drying to a brighter shade later on. As with much of the kit, building the arms is a rather unique experience, and the shoulders ended up being rather involved, although that's because I went a little overboard. The main body of the shoulders are two pieces that join together, and whilst this does initially look like a big seam line, it's actually part separation based on the original line art. To my eyes though, it looked a bit distracting, less like an intended part of the design and more like, well, a big seam line. And so I decided to combine the pieces, because I apparently love making my life more difficult. Carrying this out involved the usual method of gluing the pieces together, then sanding using 400 grit, followed by 600 grit, followed by my grey gun primer balancer. I later went back over the piece with some lightly applied white balancer however. I'm very happy with the finish. I'm still yet to perfect the art of seam line removal, but I think it does make the shoulders design flow a little more. Paint-wise, I painted the inner shoulders black as shown in the manual, and also used black flow-type marker around the lenses in front. Finally, I did use the stickers provided for the sides of the shoulders. I did initially paint them with the same Gundam marker as the inner areas, but I wasn't happy with the results, which had a bit of a rough, bumpy texture. I'm not particularly adverse to colour correcting stickers, in moderation, and I think the ones in this kit do an alright job, besides the red ones I mentioned earlier. I carried out some more, this time genuinely warranted seam line removal on the forearms. This did involve some extra work, mainly in re-establishing a panel line that runs horizontally towards the front of the arm, which I did using my craft knife. As usual, it came out a little messy, but I feel the visual impact was reduced by some light sanding and careful panel lining. The yellow piece on the upper arms could have done with being combined as well, but I was a bit wary of gluing them so close to the joints, so I left them be. The only other major cleanup required was on the rather cool flip-out guns on each arm. The dark blue plastic gave way to some rather severe gate marks, so I had to put some serious elbow grease into my sanding, whilst trying to avoid flattening the areas. The assembled arm is overall quite unusual articulation-wise. The outwards articulation from the shoulder is rather limited, but by turning the upper arm to the side, then the lower arm backwards, you do get outwards motion, at the cost of the rather strangely executed double elbow. For me, it does overall feel less than the sum of its parts. The waist of the suit wound up needing a few more steps than I'd anticipated as well. As I tend to do on my kits, the plan was to paint up the piping inside the waist using my silver Gundam marker. Except said piping was on Runner C, the one that uses ABS plastic, so the markers were off the table. Instead, I primed the piece using my usual go-to, Halford's Grey Primer, and painted it using Citadel's Stormhost Silver. A really nice paint that provides a colour and finish not far removed from the Gundam marker. I also popped a bit of Mechanicus Standard Grey and Evil Sun's Scarlet onto the piece for a little more variety. All that aside, the waist is pretty straightforward to build, even with the transformation factored in. I did find connecting it into the torso without dislodging the neck area is a little tough though, so make sure to keep the latter held in place during assembly. I was also relieved the transformation gimmick inside the hips is very solid. You won't end up transforming it by accident or pulling it from the waist entirely, which I was a little paranoid about initially. As was the case with the arms, the legs needed some seam line removal doing, and as expected, it was a bit of a nightmare, as not only are the upper legs a curved surface, they also have some really nice panel lining, which trying to maintain while sanding down the pieces was not especially fun. Ultimately, I followed a similar route to the arms, using the knife to trace over the panel lines, followed by a brown panel liner. For a little more control, I used a finer pen type rather than the flow type. I focused more on removing the seam from the direct front of the leg, so it's still rather prominent on the top, and there's a little bit of discoloration from the plastic glue as well. The varnish I applied later reduced that effect somewhat, but it's probably why seam line removal is followed by a full paint job in most builds I've seen. I've done this before myself, but the last time I did was on my high-grade Zaku 1 Sniper, who is still on my desk, prime button painted a full year later. This is your brain on procrastination, folks. There is another seam line down the second piece of the leg, but as with the upper arms earlier, I was a bit concerned about my plastic glue going walkabout, so I lobbed a bit of panel liner in there to rather poorly disguise it. Moving on to the actual construction of the legs, it's relatively familiar if you've built transforming kits like the Zeta Gundam, mainly in how the legs sort of bend backwards to form the backside of the mobile armour mode. The leg build isn't exactly groundbreaking, but there's a surprising amount of detail and part separation inside the legs, like green piping, opening panels with extra boosters inside, and some moulded in beam sabers, alongside storage for the actual beam sabers. I did notice this thing technically has 6 beam sabers on it. Where's the Gujin rebake and its ridiculous amount of arms when you need it? The feet do have a bit of hollowness to them, but it's on the inside so it's not particularly visible, and I disguised the seam line down the back piece as a panel line, because the amount of plastic glue I've indirectly inhaled building this kit has probably halved my lifespan. As for the painting, I went with Gundam marker 45 again, to paint the back of the legs, and then used the same grey from earlier to paint the moulded in sabres. I also lobbed silver and gold on the vents again, though getting the silver into all the nooks and crannies when pear-shaped, mandating a lovely bath of isopropyl alcohol for the inner leg piece. With the whole kit assembled, I jumped onto panel lining, and after my positive experience last time, I utilised the flow type Gundam marker again. I lined most of the kit with orange, although I did do the panel lines on the upper leg in brown, as I felt it drew more attention to the slightly more complex design. I had everything lined pretty quickly, although the panel lines on the side of the legs gave me grief. As with the real grade I built last time, they're very shallow and they didn't hold the marker very well. To somewhat remedy this, I lightly traced the line with my knife to try and deepen the channel slightly. When I reapplied the marker, it was still a little inconsistent, but it at least flowed better. The cleanup still required some serious care and attention, but less so. The kit was looking more or less complete, but coming off a bunch of real grade builds, and a rather detailed high grade, I fancied adding some more detail, particularly whilst the panel lines are somewhat restrained. For this, I dived into my collection of water slide decals. I made sure to stay relatively lore accurate here, with decals from the wider Universal Century, as well as some specific Zeta Gundam ones, including a couple from the mighty Zeta Verka. It can be a little tense applying these. I've always found my main weakness in applying water slide decals has been trying to remove excess moisture from the decal without moving it or picking it up. As is usually recommended, I use some cotton swabs for this, and besides a couple of decals ripping or going AWOL post-application, it was honestly a pretty painless few hours. To ensure the decals remained in place, not to mention improve the finish of the kit, I chucked my usual Montana Gold matte varnish across the kit. This did initially make the panel liner appear darker, and almost as if it were running, but fortunately everything was fine when dry. And as a nice bonus, the grey marker didn't discolour as on my Atlas Gundam. Hooray! So here's the finished Methuss, ready to bamboozle everyone with its combination of weird name, weird proportions and weird spaceship mode. I reckon the kit is slightly redesigned versus the anime, but it's still easily recognisable and replicates the transformation and gimmicks nicely. And with the extra work put in, the final kit certainly looks more at home with the newer Zeta kits. The age does still show a little pitted against the high-grade Zeta from 2017, with the later kit featuring far superior engineering and articulation. But the difference honestly isn't as stark as I'd expected. The high-grade Zeta is fairly restrained in its distribution of panel lines, as with the Methuss, and with the seam line removal and decal work I undertook, the latter does stack up with the former, if only aesthetically. As mentioned, the kit's weakest point is articulation, which is fairly bare bones. The transformation does aid in certain aspects like the knee bend, as the back armour can be moved out the way for clearance, but most of the upper body is fairly restricted. Owing to the design of the suit, there's no waist articulation whatsoever, and as previously discussed, the arm articulation can be a little tricky to work with, even with the amount of joints on offer. I am somewhat forgiving of these shortcomings, seeing how my beloved Transformers only got ankle tilts as standard 5 years ago, but I'd perfectly understand feeling underwhelmed if you built this after more recent Bandai kits. I should also note that a couple of the polycaps, mainly in the arms, are on rather prominent display with the kit built. In the case of the lower arm, it can be a little easy to pull the arm out the polycap when posing, but my bigger issue is more with aesthetics. It just looks a bit naff. The weapons loadout is pretty small, but it gets the job done, and I love how the flip-out guns are implemented. It does highlight the advantage of the strange arm articulation, with the arms being able to bend backwards slightly for a more natural aiming pose. Less successful are the beam sabers. The hands on the kit don't hold onto them especially well, and more often than not, the front half of the hand will simply fall off. It's the third kit in a row I've built where the beam sabers and hands don't mix, and I'm praying the same isn't true with my incoming real grade Zan Riser, because that thing's 80% swords. You do also get pieces for combining the suit with the high-grade Hyakushiki's Mega Bazooka launcher, except that set is from 2004, and the Hyakushiki included is from 1999, so you may want to chuck the extra parts in your fodder bin and pick up the 2016 Revive kit instead. Onto the main event, the transformation, and it's a bit of a mixed bag, but my opinions are weighted a bit more towards the positive side of the spectrum. For once, it's a 99% full transformation, with no parts forming besides the hands, which is nice compared to the high-grade Zeta Gundam, who has to be rather heavily torn apart for the Wave Rider mode. Although not much tabs in per se, besides the shoulders and the back of the legs combining, it's pretty easy getting things lined up, and the joints are more than strong enough to hold the spaceship together. Speaking of the ship in aesthetic terms, it's certainly a unique take on the space fighter. With not much in the way of wings, it actually reminds me a bit of the infamous Dodo from Grand Theft Auto 3. Just spacier and yellower. It is pretty much spot on to the anime though, and the only real visual blemish in vehicle mode is the rather glaring polycaps in the arm, made visible by the lack of hands. Ultimately, it's not my favourite mobile armour mode, not looking quite as graceful or really even flight-worthy as the likes of the Zeta or Double Zeta, but it does manage to be visually distinct from the mobile suit mode, even with its simple transformation. As mentioned, I also do really appreciate not having to rip it to pieces, as high-grade transformers often require. The kit features a Gerwalk mode too, which does what a Gerwalk mode does in looking like a plane with legs. Or in this case, a spaceship with legs. I don't think I'll be displaying him like this somehow. Overall, the Methuss was a really fun build, and I think it's definitely worth a try if you find one. It's a really eye-catching design, with a nice transformation that won't have you cursing at the instructions. The articulation, whilst a little lacking, can still provide some nice poses if you have the patience, and the built-in weapons are a nice touch that take advantage of that unusual design. Although a straight-built kit may look a little wonky, especially when pitted against Bandai's modern efforts, putting in the work on the seam lines, not to mention painting small details and applying decals, will really elevate the kit and help it to stand out even more. Even without all that extra work, I'd still recommend it, as it's an excellent introduction to transforming mobile suits to beginners, or even more experienced builders who haven't tackled a transforming suit yet. But that's all for the Methuss, who is off to join his Grips Conflict brethren on the shelf. Next time, I'll be sticking to the weird suits, but making a much needed leap away from the Universal Century, to the world of Gundam 00, a series that, model kit wise, I haven't touched since my earliest foray into Gunpla. I'll be taking a look at the Tiaran Space type, a design that's arguably even more unusual than the Methuss, and we'll see whether I can tolerate yet more seam line removal. Until next time, I hope you've all enjoyed my attempts to do the Methuss justice, and I'll see you all soon. Take care everyone.